I fixed the transmitter because someone out there might still be listening, and that single decision was about to change my life across an entire galaxy. The tower groaned above Ethan Walker like a dying giant, its rusted antenna clawing at a sky the color of cold steel, while static crackled through the battered control panel in front of him. The outpost sat alone on a plateau nearly 20,000 miles from the nearest Terran colony, a forgotten relay station abandoned decades earlier when newer satellites took over long-range communication. Ethan wiped the dust from the cracked screen with the sleeve of his work jacket and leaned closer as a faint signal flickered across the display. Magnetic storms rolled over the planet every few hours, turning most electronics into expensive paperweights. But the ancient transmitter had been built before modern convenience, back when engineers designed machines to survive the worst corners of space. He twisted a wrench, tightened the final coupling on the signal array, and muttered under his breath that if the old engineers could see this mess, they'd probably laugh at how simple the fix really was. A gust of wind whistled through the tower's metal ribs, carrying the sharp smell of ozone and cold dust across the plateau. Ethan flipped the last switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the transmitter woke up. The tower hummed like it had been waiting years to breathe again, power surging through cables thicker than his wrist as the antenna slowly rotated toward the dark horizon. Lights that had been dead for decades flickered alive along the platform railing, glowing faint blue in the stormy air. Ethan let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured, watching the signal strength climb across the screen. Somewhere in orbit, something was receiving it. That's when the sky changed. At first, Ethan thought it was just another storm front rolling in from the mountains nearly 40 miles away, but the clouds didn't move like weather. They moved with purpose. Shadows slid across the plateau as enormous shapes emerged from the upper atmosphere, sleek metallic vessels descending silently through the electric haze. Ethan stepped back from the console, squinting upward as the first ship slowed above the tower, its hull reflecting the lightning flickers crawling across the clouds. More ships followed, dozens of them, spreading across the sky like a fleet answering a long-forgotten call. "Okay," Ethan whispered slowly, one hand resting on the transmitter panel. "That's new." The largest vessel drifted closer until it hovered barely 100 yards from the tower platform. A ramp extended from its underside with mechanical precision, lowering toward the ground in a smooth arc of silver metal. Figures appeared along its edge, tall silhouettes outlined by soft white light. Ethan's heart hammered against his ribs, not with fear exactly, but with the dizzy realization that his little repair job had just invited visitors he definitely hadn't expected. The first figure stepped forward, and the air around the tower seemed to still. She was taller than any human by at least a foot, her skin glowing faint turquoise beneath the storm light, long silver hair moving gently in the wind like threads of starlight. Armor traced elegant lines along her shoulders and arms, more ceremonial than threatening, and her golden eyes locked onto Ethan the moment her boots touched the platform. The soldiers behind her raised their weapons cautiously, but the woman didn't. She simply studied him as the transmitter continued humming beside them, its signal echoing across the sky. Ethan swallowed, suddenly aware of the wrench still in his hand and the grease on his fingers. Hi," he said carefully. For several seconds the tall alien woman said nothing. Then she turned slightly toward the glowing tower, then back to Ethan, as if confirming something only she understood. When she finally spoke, her voice carried calm authority that made the entire platform feel smaller. "You," she said softly, lifting one slender finger and pointing directly at him. Ethan blinked. "Yeah." The woman's golden eyes warmed with a strange, curious light. "You activated the sovereign beacon." Ethan frowned. "The what?" The storm wind swept across the tower again as the transmitter pulsed brighter. The alien queen tilted her head slightly, studying him the way someone might study a puzzle that had suddenly solved itself. Then she said the words that would follow Ethan Walker for the rest of his life. "My husband." For a long moment Ethan Walker was convinced he had misunderstood what the alien queen had just said, because there was no possible way the tall, luminous woman standing in front of him had actually pointed at a dusty communications engineer from Ohio and calmly declared him her husband, yet the soldiers behind. Her did not laugh, and the enormous ships hovering above the plateau did not move, and the ancient transmitter beside Ethan continued humming like it had just completed the most important task of its existence. Ethan blinked slowly and lifted a grease-stained hand toward his chest just to make sure she was pointing at the right person. You mean me? He asked carefully. The queen studied him with quiet curiosity, the golden glow in her eyes reflecting the soft blue light of the tower. Yes, she replied. Simply you. Ethan let out a short breath that almost sounded like a laugh, because the entire situation felt so far outside normal human experience that his brain was still trying to find a logical explanation. Look, I think there has been some kind of mistake, he said, raising both hands slightly. I just fixed the transmitter. I did not activate anything royal or ceremonial, or whatever you called it. The sovereign beacon, the queen corrected gently as she turned her head toward the tower. The wind lifting strands of her silver hair as lightning flashed across the distant mountains. Ethan followed her gaze, and suddenly the old transmitter looked very different from how it had a few minutes earlier. Panels that had been dark now glowed faintly with intricate symbols, and along the base of the antenna a ring of light pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. Ethan stepped closer to the console again, squinting at the unfamiliar characters scrolling across the cracked display that was definitely not there. Before he muttered, one of the tall soldiers took a cautious step forward, his voice carrying respectful urgency. Your Majesty, the beacon has clearly chosen. We should proceed according to imperial protocol. The queen lifted one hand without looking back, and the soldier immediately fell silent. Ethan noticed how quickly that single gesture restored absolute quiet across the platform, which told him two things at once. First, that she was definitely in charge, and second, that whatever was happening here was apparently very serious. She walked closer to the transmitter, now her footsteps calm and steady, until she stood beside Ethan close enough that he could see faint patterns in her turquoise skin that shimmered softly in the storm light. You repaired a machine that has slept for centuries, she said, studying the glowing tower. Most civilizations forgot how to use it long ago. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. I mean, I did not really repair it. I just replaced the signal regulator and rerouted the power feed. The wiring was a mess. The queen looked at him again, as if he had just spoken a particularly fascinating language to you. It was simple, she said quietly. To my people, it is sacred. Ethan glanced up at the massive ships still hanging above the plateau, and then back at the woman who had calmly called him her husband 5 minutes after they met, and he could not stop the thought that formed in his mind. So, just to be clear, he said slowly, you are telling me that because I fixed an old transmitter, the universe now thinks we are married? The queen tilted her head slightly, and for the first time something that almost resembled amusement touched her expression. The universe did not decide, she said softly. The beacon did, and for thousands of years the beacon has never been wrong. The wind circled the ancient tower like it was trying to understand what had just happened, while the transmitter continued to pulse with quiet blue light, and Ethan Walker stood there staring at the alien queen, as if the universe had just played the strangest joke in history. He slowly placed the wrench back onto the console, and looked from the glowing beacon to the fleet of ships hanging silently above the plateau, then back to the tall turquoise woman beside him. I am still pretty sure there has been a misunderstanding, Ethan said carefully, because where I come from, fixing an old radio does not usually lead to unexpected marriage proposals. The queen watched him with steady patience, her golden eyes reflecting the slow rhythm of the beacon, as if the machine itself was speaking through the light. Your world does not possess sovereign beacons, she replied calmly. Ethan crossed his arms and leaned against the edge of the transmitter panel, trying to ground himself in something familiar like cold metal and faulty wiring. Okay, that part one believe, because if Earth had one of these things, someone would have definitely turned it into a tourist attraction by now. The queen tilted her head, slightly studying his expression the same way a scientist might examine an unusual discovery. You are remarkably calm for someone whose life has changed in a single moment, she said. Ethan let out a quiet breath and glanced toward the horizon, where the alien ships floated against the storm clouds like silent mountains. Honestly, I think my brain is still catching up, he said. If I start panicking now, I might miss something important. The queen looked at the transmitter again. The beacon awakens only when someone capable of restoring its voice appears, she explained softly. For thousands of years it has chosen leaders, partners, and guardians of the empire. Ethan raised one eyebrow. Hold on, you are telling me that machine has been matchmaking for thousands of years? The queen did not answer immediately. Instead, she stepped closer to the tower, and placed one hand lightly against the glowing metal surface, and the ring of light around the base brightened in response. The beacon does not choose randomly. She said it chooses individuals who restore connection. Ethan frowned slightly as he processed the words restore. Connection, you mean communication? He asked. She nodded slowly. Yes, the Empire once stretched across hundreds of star systems, but distance created silence, and silence created division. The beacon was built to recognize those who bring voices together. Ethan looked back down at the control panel, where his repaired circuits now glowed beneath the glass, and a strange realization crept into his thoughts. I only fixed the signal pathway, he said quietly. The Queen turned toward him again, and there was something warmer in her gaze now. Exactly. Ethan looked up at the towering antenna and then out toward the massive fleet still waiting in the sky, and he could not ignore the strange coincidence that he had spent most of his life repairing machines designed to reconnect people across impossible distances. So the beacon thinks the best way to reconnect your empire is to pair you with a communications engineer from Earth, he said slowly. The Queen stepped closer until she stood beside him again, the storm wind moving gently around them as the transmitter hummed between them. Perhaps the beacon does not think in the way you expect, she said. Ethan gave a quiet half smile. Yeah, that seems obvious. The Queen looked at him thoughtfully, then asked a question that caught him completely off guard. Tell me, Ethan Walker, why were you repairing a forgotten transmitter on a planet that no one else cared about? Ethan hesitated, then shrugged lightly. Because someone out there might still need to hear a signal. The Queen watched him for several seconds before speaking again. Her voice was softer, now almost thoughtful. That answer, Ethan Walker, is exactly why the beacon chose you. The beacon continued to glow with a steady pulse as if it were breathing again after centuries of silence, and Ethan Walker stood beside it with his arms loosely crossed, trying to process the quiet certainty in the alien Queen's voice. The wind rolled across the plateau, carrying the low hum of distant engines from the fleet hovering above them, and the entire sky seemed to be waiting for something. Ethan finally shook his head slowly. You realize this is completely insane from my perspective, right? He said. I came out here to fix a communication relay that barely worked, and now, apparently, an ancient alien machine thinks I am supposed to help run an empire. The Queen looked toward the ships above them, then back at Ethan, and there was a thoughtful calm in her expression that made the chaos of the moment feel strangely balanced. Your perspective is understandable, she said quietly, but the beacon has guided my people through many centuries. Ethan glanced again at the glowing tower, and then at the faint symbols moving across the transmitter screen. They look like signal protocols, he muttered almost to himself. Layers of routing patterns and relay commands, all nested together, like someone designed the entire structure around communication pathways. The Queen noticed the way his eyes moved across the interface. You understand its language, she said. Ethan shrugged lightly. Not exactly, but I understand what it is trying to do. It is like an old switchboard operator connecting lines across a huge network, except this one is built to work across star systems. The Queen watched him for a moment longer, and then nodded slowly. That is why the beacon answered you, she said. Most people see a relic, you see a voice waiting to speak. Ethan leaned back against the console again, looking out at the storm clouds rolling slowly beyond the plateau. I spent most of my career fixing systems people stopped caring about, he said quietly. Old satellites abandoned, relay towers forgotten, deep space repeaters. Most of the time the work feels pointless until suddenly someone somewhere hears the signal again. The Queen listened without interrupting, and the golden light in her eyes softened slightly. My empire once depended on signals like the one you restored, she said. Worlds separated by light years could still hear each other because the beacons carried their voices across the darkness. Ethan nodded slowly. I get that silence can break things faster than distance. The Queen stepped closer to the tower and rested her hand against the glowing metal again, and the beacon responded with a brighter pulse. Ethan noticed the pattern immediately. The light was not random, it followed a rhythm, like encoded transmissions spreading outward through space. That is not just a power cycle, he said quietly. The beacon is broadcasting. She turned toward him. Yes. Ethan pushed himself upright and leaned closer to the screen, studying the cascade of alien symbols as they scrolled across the interface. It is sending a synchronization signal, he explained slowly, like a master transmitter calling other nodes in the network. The Queen watched him with growing interest. Ethan tapped the cracked glass lightly. Every few seconds the pattern repeats, but it expands further each time the beacon is searching for something out in the distance. The storm clouds parted for a brief moment, revealing the stars above the planet, and at the same time one of the massive ships overhead shifted position, as if responding to the signal. The Queen followed Ethan's gaze toward the sky. "They are answering," she said softly. Ethan blinked. "Wait, who is answering?" The Queen looked back at him, and for the first time there was a hint of anticipation in her voice. "Not who," she said. "How many?" Ethan slowly turned toward the glowing tower again, and the realization crept into his mind, like the beginning of a much larger story. The transmitter he repaired was not just a forgotten relay station, it was the first voice in a network that had just begun waking up again. The beacon's light spread outward into the dark sky like ripples across a silent ocean, and Ethan Walker stood frozen beside the transmitter console, watching the pattern repeat again and again across the cracked display. Each pulse traveled farther than the last, carrying the same ancient signal through the upper atmosphere and into space. The air around the tower vibrated with a low mechanical harmony that had not been heard on this world for centuries. Ethan leaned closer to the screen, studying the timing intervals with the instinctive focus of a man who had spent years repairing communication networks across forgotten corners of space. "It is definitely not just calling one receiver," he said quietly. "It is reaching for an entire system." The alien Queen stood beside him with calm patience, her silver hair shifting gently in the wind as the glowing ring around the tower base brightened again. "Yes," she replied, "the beacon was designed to awaken others." Ethan rubbed his chin thoughtfully as another wave of symbols streamed across the console. "The architecture is layered," he explained, "like a relay cascade. One transmitter wakes the next, and that one wakes another until the network is alive again." The Queen nodded slightly. "That is how our empire once stayed connected across distances no single ship could travel quickly." Ethan straightened and looked up toward the enormous fleet waiting above the plateau. Their presence made more sense. Now they had not come to conquer or inspect the old tower. They had come because the beacon had called them here from across the stars. Ethan exhaled slowly. "So this thing might be reconnecting dozens of systems right now," the Queen answered with quiet certainty. "Possibly hundreds." Ethan blinked once, and then leaned back against the console again, trying to imagine a network that large, spreading across light years like a living web. "That is a lot of messages waking up at once," he said. The Queen looked toward the horizon where distant lightning flickered through the clouds. "When the beacons fall silent, entire worlds can drift apart," she said softly. "When they speak again, those worlds remember they are not alone." Ethan glanced sideways at her and could not miss the deeper meaning in her voice. "That sounds like experience talking." The Queen remained quiet for a moment as another pulse of light rolled through the tower. "Many generations ago, the network collapsed," she explained slowly. "Political rivalries, distance, and pride all grew stronger when the voices between worlds faded." Ethan watched the glowing antenna rotate slightly, as if searching the sky for something specific. "Communication problems," he said quietly. She nodded yes. Ethan folded his arms and studied the expanding signal pattern again. "That is the strange part," he said. "Most empires in history try to solve problems with bigger fleets or stronger technology, but your ancient engineers built a system designed to reconnect conversations instead." The Queen looked back at him with something almost like approval in her golden eyes. "Understanding each other is more powerful than conquering silence," she said. Ethan smiled faintly at that, then glanced toward the stars again, where several of the alien ships had shifted position following the broadcast signal. The tower pulsed again, and the console screen flashed with a new sequence of responses. Ethan leaned forward immediately. "Wait, that is new," he said quickly. The Queen stepped closer. "What do you see?" Ethan pointed at the scrolling data, multiple nodes responding at different distances. He explained some signals are coming from ships, but others are much farther away. The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. "How far?" Ethan studied the timing delay and the faint coordinates appearing beside each signal. Then he slowly looked up from the console. "The nearest ones are only a few thousand miles away," he said, "but the others." Ethan hesitated and then finished the sentence carefully. "They are coming from places light years beyond this planet, and they are all waking up at the same time." The transmitter pulsed again, and the blue light rolled outward across the storm clouds like a heartbeat spreading through the sky, while Ethan Walker stared at the console as more response signals began appearing across the cracked screen, one after another, each marked with coordinates and transmission delays that stretched across distances his mind struggled to comprehend. He leaned closer until his shoulder nearly touched the metal panel and quietly counted the timing gaps between signals. This is not just a few satellites, he said slowly. These are entire stations, maybe ancient relay points scattered across multiple systems. The alien queen stood beside him, watching the glowing tower with calm focus. As the wind moved softly around the platform, the beacons were placed across the empire long before my reign. She said some were forgotten. When the network collapsed, Ethan scrolled through the data stream with careful movements of his fingers across the worn control interface every few seconds. Another signal appeared, and the transmitter adjusted its output slightly to accommodate the expanding communication web. This thing is rebuilding the map, he murmured. The queen turned toward him. Explain. Ethan pointed at the display, where faint lines were beginning to connect between responding nodes. Imagine thousands of communication towers spread across space, he said. If one wakes up, it can call the others, and when they answer, the system begins mapping the routes again, like a giant switchboard reconnecting lines across the galaxy. The queen watched the pattern form, and her golden eyes reflected the expanding network. And once the map is restored, Ethan nodded slowly, then any world connected to the beacon network can hear every other world again. The idea hung in the air between them while the tower continued broadcasting its ancient signal. And somewhere high above the plateau, one of the massive alien ships shifted position slightly, as if adjusting to the new transmission flow. Ethan noticed the movement and glanced upward. Looks like your fleet is already responding to the network, she said quietly. They are listening for confirmation. Ethan tapped the screen again, and the transmitter responded with a soft hum as new coordinates appeared beside the signal logs. Wait, he said. The queen stepped closer. What is it? Ethan pointed to a cluster of responses forming a triangular pattern on the display, 3 nodes responding from extremely long range. He explained their delay times are massive. The queen studied the numbers. How far? Ethan calculated quickly, running the conversion in his head based on the signal speed and the echo delay. Then he leaned back with a quiet whistle. Those towers are at least 20 light years away, he said softly. The queen did not appear surprised. The beacon network once stretched far beyond that. Ethan looked back at the transmitter tower rising above them, the ancient metal structure now glowing like a lighthouse calling across the stars. When I repaired the signal regulator, he said, I thought I was fixing one forgotten station, but what actually happened? The queen finished the thought calmly. You awakened. The first voice. Ethan watched as the signal pattern expanded again across the console, and the new network lines stretched farther across the map, forming a slowly growing web of communication that had been silent for centuries. If this keeps going, he said carefully, your empire might suddenly be able to talk to itself again. The queen turned her gaze toward the distant horizon, where the storm clouds were beginning to thin, revealing a clear line of stars above the plateau. That was always the purpose of the beacon. Ethan looked back at the screen where the signals continued multiplying, and another realization began forming in his mind. If the entire network wakes up at once, he said slowly, every world connected to it will know something just changed. The queen nodded. Yes. Ethan folded his arms thoughtfully and glanced toward the alien fleet hovering in the sky. Then your empire is about to receive a message it has not heard in centuries. The queen looked at the glowing transmitter and answered with quiet certainty, a message that the silence is finally over. The transmitter continued to breathe light into the sky while the wind swept across the plateau, carrying the faint metallic hum of the awakened tower, and Ethan Walker stood with his hands resting on the console, watching the signal map grow across the screen like a living constellation. Every few seconds another node appeared as distant beacons answered the ancient call, and the system carefully synchronized each response until a vast communication web slowly reassembled itself across the dark canvas of space. Ethan leaned closer, studying the timing delays with focused curiosity. The network is stabilizing, he said quietly. The alien queen remained beside him, her golden eyes reflecting the glow of the transmitter, while she observed the unfolding pattern. For centuries these signals were silent, she said softly. Entire systems believed the network had vanished. Ethan nodded as he adjusted one of the transmitter controls to smooth a small fluctuation in the signal output. The structure of this system is incredible, he said. Whoever designed it understood something most engineers forget. The queen turned slightly toward him. What did they understand? Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his attention to the console. That communication is not just about sending information, He said it is about trust. A network only works when every node believes the others will answer. The queen studied his expression carefully. That belief was once the foundation of the empire, she said. Ethan tapped the side of the display where a series of new signals had appeared in rapid succession. These are not automated responses, he said slowly. Some of these signals contain manual authentication codes. That means someone out there is watching the network wake up in real time. The queen looked up toward the distant stars, then back to the console. Yes, she said, many worlds will notice this change. Ethan leaned back slightly as the system recalibrated the beacon output, and the tower responded with a deeper harmonic tone that vibrated through the metal floor beneath their feet. Another pattern of lights spread across the interface, forming a wider communication grid. This thing is not just reconnecting stations, he said, it is rebuilding traffic routes. The queen nodded. That was its purpose. The original architects of the beacon network believed that if communication pathways remained open, the empire would remain united. Ethan folded his arms thoughtfully. That is actually pretty smart, he said. When people stop talking, misunderstandings start growing. The queen regarded him with a calm expression. That is a lesson many civilizations learn too late. Ethan looked up at the rotating antenna high above them, its luminous ring casting a pale blue glow across the platform and the surrounding plateau as the storm clouds slowly drifted apart, revealing a clearer view of the stars. One of the ships overhead moved again, repositioning itself within the expanding signal grid. Ethan noticed the maneuver and pointed upward. Your fleet is adjusting to the new communication routes, he said. The queen followed his gaze. They are aligning with the beacon network so they can relay the signals farther. Ethan smiled faintly. That means the network is growing even faster now. The console chimed softly, and a new cluster of signals appeared on the map. Ethan leaned forward again with renewed focus. Wait, these are different. The queen stepped closer. How so? Ethan highlighted the new signals on the display. Their response pattern is synchronized with the beacon, but they are not ancient towers, he explained. These are active stations built with modern technology. The queen's eyes brightened slightly. That means other civilizations have begun building their own systems around the old network. Ethan nodded slowly, realizing the implication. If they have been waiting for the original beacons to return, then this signal we just started might be the confirmation they needed. The queen watched the expanding map carefully, and the faint glow of the transmitter reflected across her turquoise skin. Then the silence that divided the stars may finally, and Ethan looked out across the plateau and into the widening field of stars above them, where the ancient beacon now carried a signal that echoed across distances measured in light years, and he quietly realized that the small repair he had completed only an hour earlier had just begun reconnecting an entire galaxy. The ancient tower continued broadcasting its steady rhythm into the night sky, and the blue light pulsing from the antenna painted long reflections across the metal platform, while Ethan Walker stood beside the transmitter console, watching the signal network expand further across the display. Every few seconds another response arrived, and the map of distant systems grew more complex, as if forgotten stars were slowly remembering how to speak again. Ethan leaned closer to the screen, adjusting the signal filter so the overlapping transmissions became easier to read. The pattern is stabilizing faster than I expected, he said quietly. The alien queen remained beside him, her posture calm but attentive as the wind moved softly through the tower structure. The beacon has waited a long time to speak again, she replied. Ethan nodded while scanning the incoming data streams. Whoever built this network designed it to rebuild itself once the first voice returned, he said. The queen studied the glowing transmitter and the slowly rotating antenna above them. Our ancestors believed silence was the greatest danger to an empire, she said. Ethan smiled faintly. That is actually true for any civilization. The console chimed again, and several new signals appeared grouped together in a tight formation. Ethan frowned slightly at the pattern. That is interesting, he said. The queen stepped closer. What do you see? Ethan pointed at the cluster of signals. These responses are not scattered like the older beacons, he explained. They are coordinated. The queen looked at the screen, carefully coordinated. How? Ethan highlighted the transmission intervals. They are responding in synchronized timing cycles. That usually means a central command station is directing them. The queen considered this for a moment, then asked, that would mean another government or alliance has been watching the beacon network. Ethan nodded slowly. Exactly. The moment the tower woke up, they began answering together like they were waiting for Confirmation that the system was alive again. The Queen looked out toward the distant stars where the alien fleet hovered quietly above the plateau. If other civilizations built their systems around the beacon network, they may have depended on it more than we realized. Ethan folded his arms thoughtfully. That would explain the synchronized responses. If they believed the network might return someday, they would have prepared for this moment. The transmitter pulsed again, and the console filled with a longer signal burst that carried encoded identification markers. Ethan leaned forward immediately. Wait, this is a direct communication request, he said. The Queen turned toward him, from whom Ethan quickly decoded the routing path displayed on the screen. The request originated from one of the newly awakened nodes, but the signal had been relayed through several others across the expanding network. That means the sender is extremely far away, he explained, possibly 30 light years or more. The Queen studied the incoming signal, and her golden eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. What does the message say? Ethan worked through the translation interface built into the transmitter system and watched as the alien symbols gradually resolved into a recognizable structure. It is written in the same protocol as the beacon network, he said quietly. That means the sender understands the original architecture. The Queen waited silently as the final lines of the transmission appeared across the display. Ethan read the message once, then looked up slowly with a thoughtful expression. The sender is not asking who activated the beacon, he said. The Queen tilted her head slightly. Then what are they asking? Ethan glanced at the glowing tower above them, and then back at the screen where the message continued repeating across the network. They are asking if the one chosen by the beacon is ready to answer for the entire network. The Queen's gaze shifted toward Ethan with quiet intensity. And are you ready? Ethan looked out across the plateau, where the ancient transmitter now carried a voice powerful enough to reach worlds dozens of light years away, and he realized the small repair he had made earlier that evening had just placed him at the center of a conversation that an entire galaxy had been waiting centuries to begin. The message repeated across the console in steady intervals while the transmitter tower above them continued sending its deep rhythmic pulse into the dark sky. And Ethan Walker stood motionless for several seconds, staring at the glowing display, as if the words themselves carried more weight than the entire fleet hovering above the plateau. The alien Queen watched him quietly, the golden light in her eyes reflecting the flicker of the ancient interface. Well, she said softly. Ethan exhaled slowly and rubbed the back of his neck. That depends on what answering for the entire network actually means, he replied. The Queen stepped closer to the console and studied the message herself. The beacon has always chosen individuals who represent the unity of the Empire, she said. When the network awakens, the chosen voice speaks first. Ethan raised one eyebrow. You mean the entire galaxy is waiting for me to say something? The Queen did not hesitate. Yes. Ethan leaned against the console, again glancing up at the stars where the alien ships floated like silent guardians above the plateau. I fix broken transmitters for a living, he said quietly. I am not exactly trained for interstellar diplomacy. The Queen regarded him calmly. That may be exactly why the beacon chose you. Ethan looked back at the console, where the message continued to repeat through the network. Every relay node that had awakened now carried the same question, and the signal web had grown so large that its map filled the entire display with lines stretching across dozens of star systems. If I send a reply, he said slowly, every one of those worlds will hear it. The Queen nodded. That is correct. Ethan gave a quiet breath of disbelief. That is a lot of pressure for a guy with a wrench. The Queen's expression softened slightly. Pressure reveals character, she said. Ethan looked down at the console again, watching the signal pathways flow through the system like living currents of light. You said the beacon chooses people who reconnect the Empire, he said. The Queen nodded once Ethan pointed to the signal map. Then the first thing they should hear is not a command. The Queen studied him with curiosity. What should they hear? Ethan thought for a moment, then began adjusting the transmitter controls again, carefully rerouting the outgoing channel through the main broadcast circuit. The tower responded immediately with a deeper harmonic tone as the signal strength increased. You are preparing a reply, the Queen observed. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, I guess I am. He paused for a moment and glanced toward her before continuing. I have spent most of my life repairing communication lines between people who stopped listening to each other. If this network is waking up after centuries of silence, the first message should remind everyone what it is actually for. The Queen watched him closely. And what is that? Ethan finished calibrating the transmitter output and rested his hand lightly on the activation switch while the ancient beacon hummed with growing intensity around them. Communication, he said simply. The Queen's golden eyes brightened slightly. That answer sounds very human. Ethan gave a small smile. Then maybe that is exactly what the galaxy needs to hear. The transmitter pulsed again, waiting for the first outgoing signal, while the entire network of awakened beacons held its breath across the stars, and Ethan Walker realized that somewhere far beyond this lonely plateau, entire civilizations were listening for the words he was about to send. The transmitter waited in perfect silence for a fraction of a second that somehow felt longer than the last 100 years of quiet the beacon network had endured, and Ethan Walker rested his hand on the activation switch while the entire console glowed with the synchronized signals of distant star systems. Listening through the ancient communication web, the alien queen stood beside him with calm focus, her golden eyes reflecting the pulsing light from the tower above them. The message request repeated across the screen, waiting for a response that would travel farther than any single voice had carried in centuries. Ethan let out a slow breath and spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Well, I guess there is no such thing as a small repair job anymore." The Queen observed him carefully before speaking. "When the beacon chooses someone, it rarely chooses comfort." Ethan gave a faint smile. "I am starting to understand that." He straightened slightly and adjusted the outgoing transmission channel so the beacon's signal would broadcast across every active node in the network. The system responded immediately, as if it had been waiting for this moment, its ancient circuits humming with renewed purpose, while the antenna above rotated toward the open sky. Ethan glanced up briefly at the stars, where the alien fleet hovered in quiet formation, watching the tower, like guardians witnessing the rebirth of something older than their own ships. Then he looked back down at the console where the communication interface now displayed a single open channel ready to carry the first voice across the awakened network. The Queen spoke softly. "What will you say?" Ethan rested both hands on the console and thought for a moment, because somewhere beyond the clouds, entire civilizations were listening to the signal that had not spoken in generations. And whatever he said now would become the first words the galaxy heard after centuries of silence. Finally, he nodded to himself and activated the broadcast channel. The beacon pulsed brighter instantly, sending the transmission outward through every relay node that had answered its call. Ethan leaned closer to the microphone panel and spoke clearly. "Hello to whoever is listening out there. My name is Ethan Walker. I am a communications engineer from Earth, and about an hour ago, I accidentally repaired a transmitter that apparently belonged to the oldest network in the galaxy." The Queen watched him carefully, but did not interrupt. Ethan continued, his voice calm and steady as the beacon carried his words across unimaginable distances. "I do not know every civilization connected to this network, and I definitely was not expecting to speak to an entire galaxy tonight. But I do know one thing: communication systems exist for a reason. They are built so that no world has to face the silence alone." He paused briefly while the console displayed confirmation that his words were being relayed through the expanding beacon grid. The signal map showed lines of light racing outward across star systems as each node repeated the message farther into space. Ethan spoke again. "If you are hearing this signal, it means the network is alive again, and that means every world connected to it has a choice. We can stay silent like before, or we can start listening to each other again." The transmission ended with a quiet tone from the console, and Ethan leaned back slightly as the beacon resumed its rhythmic pulse beside them. For several seconds, nothing else happened. Then the console chimed softly. The Queen looked at the screen. "The network is responding," she said. Ethan leaned forward again, watching the display fill with incoming signals from dozens of distant systems, all answering the first message sent through the beacon in centuries, and he realized that the galaxy had not been waiting for a command. It had simply been waiting for someone to start the conversation. The console erupted with incoming signals so quickly that the old transmitter display struggled to keep up, and Ethan Walker leaned forward instinctively as the ancient system filled with voices from across the beacon network. Each signal appeared as a line of light on the expanding map, spreading across star systems dozens of light years away, and the soft chiming tones from the console blended into a steady harmonic rhythm. The alien Queen stood beside him, watching the display with calm focus, while the tower above them continued sending its deep pulsing signal into the sky. "They are answering," she said quietly. Ethan nodded slowly as he scrolled through the incoming transmissions. Some are sending authentication codes. He explained that means they recognize the original beacon protocols. The Queen studied the symbols forming across the screen for many worlds. The beacon network became a legend. She said they believed it might never speak again. Ethan leaned closer to the display, reading fragments of translated data streams that appeared as the system processed the messages. Most of these signals are not political commands or military traffic, he said thoughtfully. They are confirmation pings and status reports. The Queen looked toward him. That means they are reconnecting. Ethan smiled faintly. That is exactly what it means. Another sequence of signals arrived, and the map expanded again, forming a dense web of connections stretching farther into deep space. Ethan adjusted the routing filter so the transmitter could organize the responses without overloading the system. Whoever built this network really understood scalability, he said quietly. Even with hundreds of nodes waking up, the beacon still keeps everything synchronized. The Queen watched the glowing tower above them. It was designed to grow as the Empire grew. Ethan nodded and continued reviewing the transmissions while the network stabilized. More worlds were joining the signal flow, and the display began sorting their responses into categories: civilian relays, research stations, trade hubs, and planetary communication arrays, all answering the same ancient call. Suddenly, one signal appeared brighter than the others, and the console emitted a deeper tone that made Ethan pause. That one is different, he said. The Queen stepped closer. What kind of signal? Ethan isolated the transmission and studied the identification code carefully. This is a central coordination channel, he explained. Possibly a diplomatic council or alliance command. The Queen observed the code pattern carefully. That frequency belonged to the original Imperial Assembly. Ethan looked at her with surprise. Wait, your empire still maintains the old assembly channel? The Queen shook her head slowly. Not actively. It has remained silent since the network collapsed. Ethan returned his attention to the console. Then someone just reopened it. The signal resolved into a translated message that spread across the display. With careful clarity, Ethan read the text once and then glanced at the Queen. They are requesting confirmation of your presence, he said. The Queen's expression remained composed. That is expected. Ethan read the next line, and his eyebrows lifted slightly. They are also asking about me. The Queen turned toward him. Of course, they are. Ethan leaned back against the console again, looking up toward the stars, where the alien fleet waited quietly above the plateau. The beacon shows you, he said. That means the entire network sees you as part of this moment. The Queen nodded. Once the chosen voice never stands alone. Ethan watched the signals continue arriving across the console and realized that the conversation he started minutes earlier was now spreading across an entire galaxy, with civilizations answering each other through a network that had been silent for centuries. And the quiet plateau beneath the ancient tower had suddenly become the center of something far larger than either of them expected. The ancient transmitter continued its steady rhythm beneath the dark sky, while the console overflowed with signals from worlds that had not spoken to one another for centuries. And Ethan Walker stood quietly watching the living map of the beacon network expand until it resembled a constellation drawn across half the galaxy. Each new transmission appeared like a pulse of light traveling through the web, and the plateau around the tower seemed strangely calm compared to the immense conversation unfolding above it. The alien Queen remained beside him, her posture composed yet attentive as the system organized the incoming messages. They are not simply answering you, she said softly. They are answering each other. Ethan nodded slowly while adjusting the signal filter so the transmitter could process the growing traffic. The network is routing their replies through the beacon automatically, he explained. That means the system is rebuilding full communication pathways, not just broadcasting a single message. The Queen studied the display where clusters of signals began forming regional groups like communities rediscovering one another after a long separation. Many of these worlds believed the others were gone, she said quietly. Ethan glanced at her. That is what happens when communication disappears. People start assuming the worst about silence. The Queen looked toward the glowing antenna rising above them. The architects of the beacon feared that very outcome. Ethan leaned against the console again, while the harmonic tone of the tower deepened slightly as more nodes joined the network. You know, he said thoughtfully, most communication systems fail because people treat them like machines instead of relationships. The Queen turned toward him. Explain. Ethan gestured toward the expanding map on the display. that network only works because every world answering the signal believes someone on the other side will listen again, if even a few systems had ignored the beacon tonight, the entire structure would have stayed weak. The Queen watched the signals carefully, but they did not ignore it. Ethan smiled faintly. No, they did not. The console chimed again, and the central coordination channel opened once more, displaying a longer transmission that carried identification markers from dozens of systems simultaneously. Ethan read through the translation slowly, while the Queen waited beside him. They are forming a joint council session, he said. Quietly, the Queen's golden eyes reflected the lines of text appearing across the interface. The old assembly. Ethan nodded. It looks like the moment the beacon activated, every system that recognized the protocol sent representatives to the channel. The Queen observed the message carefully. That council once governed the network itself. Ethan leaned closer to the console, studying the final line of the transmission. They are asking for confirmation that the beacon has chosen a new voice, he said. The Queen turned toward him. And what will you tell them? Ethan looked up toward the ancient tower, whose light now spread across the plateau like a quiet lighthouse calling through the stars, and he realized that the signal he repaired had done more than reconnect a forgotten communication grid. It had awakened the possibility that an entire galaxy might begin listening to itself again. I will tell them the truth, he said simply. The Queen waited for him to continue. Ethan glanced back at the console where the council channel remained open across dozens of star systems, waiting for the answer. I will tell them that the beacon did not choose a ruler, he said slowly. It chose someone who understands why the network exists. The Queen studied his expression. And why does it exist? Ethan looked out across the quiet plateau, where the wind moved through the tower, and the beacon carried its signal across distances measured in light years. Because no civilization should ever believe it is alone in the silence again. The beacon tower stood like a lighthouse against the dark sky, while its steady blue pulse traveled outward through the ancient network and across the silent distances between stars. And Ethan Walker rested both hands on the transmitter console as the council channel remained open before him, carrying the attention of worlds that had not shared a single conversation for centuries. The wind moved quietly through the metal framework of the tower, and the plateau beneath it felt impossibly small compared to the vast communication web now alive above it. The alien Queen stood beside him with calm authority, her golden eyes reflecting the endless streams of signals that continued flowing through the system. The council is waiting, she said softly. Ethan nodded once and opened the central broadcast channel again, knowing that whatever he said next would travel across every active node in the network and reach civilizations that had been separated by silence for generations. He leaned toward the microphone panel and spoke with steady clarity to the worlds listening across the beacon network. My name is Ethan Walker. I am the engineer who repaired the transmitter on this forgotten tower, and I know many of you are asking why the beacon has chosen a human voice tonight. The console confirmed the signal was being relayed through dozens of star systems. As Ethan continued, I cannot claim to represent every civilization connected to this network, and I am certainly not the ruler of anything larger than a toolbox, but I understand why this beacon exists, and that matters more than authority. The alien Queen watched him carefully, but said nothing while his words carried outward through the web of awakened relays. This network was not built to control worlds or command fleets. It was built so that no voice would ever disappear into silence again. When communication fails, misunderstandings grow, and when misunderstandings grow, entire civilizations drift apart. The beacon exists to prevent that. Silence. Ethan paused briefly as confirmation signals began appearing across the display, showing that his message was reaching farther and farther across the network. Tonight, the silence between your worlds ended because one forgotten transmitter began speaking again, and the moment it did, every one of you answered. That tells me something important. The galaxy did not lose the desire to communicate. It only lost the signal. The beacon can restore that signal, but the choice to listen to each other belongs to every civilization connected to this network. Ethan finished the transmission and closed the broadcast channel, while the tower above them continued sending its rhythmic pulse into the star-filled sky. For several seconds the console remained quiet, then the incoming responses began arriving again, but this time the signals carried a different tone. The council channel filled with Acknowledgements and cooperative routing commands as systems across the network began establishing direct connections with one another. Ethan leaned back slightly, watching the map stabilize into a bright lattice of communication pathways. The Queen observed the display with calm satisfaction. The network is no longer silent, she said. Ethan smiled faintly and looked up toward the stars, where the fleet hovered like distant constellations, reflecting the beacon's glow. Funny thing about signals, he said quietly, once people hear them again, they usually remember how to talk. The Queen regarded him thoughtfully, then lifted her gaze toward the tower, whose light continued spreading through the galaxy. Like a promise carried on ancient circuits, he was not born to conquer the stars, she said softly. Ethan glanced at her with curiosity. The Queen finished the thought, while watching the beacon pulse into the night. He was born to remind them what their voices are for.